We humans just love old things, don't we? We love historic architecture and antique furniture and vintage clothing and retro video games and old books. That doesn't sound very sexy. Let's call them classics instead. Everyone on board with that? Right, that's that sorted. Thank you so much for Wait, what do you mean there's a difference between an old book and a classic?
I'd like to give you 5 reasons, 5 rough and ready criteria for identifying a classic of literature.
I think a classic is a great example of a book of its kind.
A classic is a book which dissolves the idea of time and distance.
A classic is a book which is well known and considered to be of a high literary standard.
First, the work addresses a permanent, universal concern about the human condition.
Fine, let's talk about it. Hello and welcome to Spencer's Library. I'm Claudia, and I'm here to convince you that classics are not what you think they are. Ooh, intrigue. Are you intrigued? Are you intrigued yet? Are you? Let's start this video by doing what they explicitly told you not to do in school, and that's to start an essay with a dictionary definition. This is what we get from the trusty OED. A classic is a work of art of recognized and established value, which is pretty much how we commonly use the word. When we call a book a classic work of literature, we're elevating it. We're saying that a book is not just old, it's special. It's not like the other books. It has recognized and established value. But recognized and established how? And more importantly, by whom? How do we decide what counts as a classic and what doesn't? This is a trick question, by the way, because as you'll find out, there is no we in the equation, but you'll see. It's a question that has been answered many times by many different people. The first person to define the term in the modern sense, as in talking specifically about books, was French philosopher Charles-Augustin Sainte-Beuve. In an essay with the title What is a Classic, or as he insisted on calling it, Qu'est-ce qu'un classique, he wrote, "A true classic, as I should like to hear it defined, is an author who has enriched the human mind, increased its treasure and caused it to advance a step, who has discovered some moral and not equivocal truth, or revealed some eternal passion in that heart where all seemed known and discovered, who has expressed his thought, observation or invention in no matter what form, only provided it be broad and great, refined and sensible, sane and beautiful in itself, who has spoken to all in his own peculiar style, a style which is found to be also that of the whole world, a style new without neologism, new and old, easily contemporary with all time." That's what he said, but in French. So here's a bit of trivia for you. When do you think did Sainte-Beuve write this essay? Was it in A, 1850, B, 1903, C, 1960, or D, 1988? If you said A, you win. Mind you, there's no prize, but you can feel really good about yourself. Give yourself a pat on the back and spare a thought for those fools who thought the concept of classic literature didn't exist until the 20th century. That's right, most of the books we consider classics now weren't even written when Sainte-Beuve first defined the term. And yet, the popular definition hasn't really changed since 1850. In 1957, T.S. Eliot argued that a classic must express some form of universality to showcase, and I'm using his phrasing here, the maturity of a culture. The classic must, within its formal limitations, express the maximum possible of the whole range of feelings which represents the character of the people who speak that language. This is a popular idea when it comes to the question of what makes a classic. This notion that a classic book expresses some sort of universal feeling or idea or philosophy, something true about humanity that we can see ourselves in. In 1986, Italo Calvino wrote an article in which he proposed a 14-point checklist to see whether a book is a classic or not. There's some absolute gems in there, like number 4. A classic is a book which, with each rereading, offers as much of a sense of discovery as the first reading. Number 8 contains a word I have no shame in admitting I had to Google. A classic is a work which constantly generates a pulviscular cloud of critical discourse around it, but which always shakes the particles off. Or number 10. A classic is the term given to any book which comes to represent the whole universe, a book on par with ancient talismans. I don't want to waste too much time on this because it should be glaringly obvious to anyone watching that this notion is deeply flawed. No book represents all of humanity in a way that makes it resonate with everyone, and many books that do resonate with lots of readers are not considered classics, but we'll return to that point later. First, I'm going to do the second thing your teacher told you not to do, and that's to cite Wikipedia. Wikipedia says, a classic is a book accepted as being exemplary or particularly noteworthy. Again, this begs the question of who? Who decides what's considered exemplary or particularly noteworthy? There's no democratic vote among the readers of the world to form a consensus on this matter. Though wouldn't it be great if there was?
Henry IV, Part 1, Henry IV, Part 2, Matt Hancock's Pandemic Diaries.
The problem isn't so much the list of books we consider classics changes over time. Lots of definitions change. My vintage 1980s sofa, for example, would have been simply described as old 20 years ago. And 40 years ago, it was brand new. In 20 years' time, it might become an antique, if my cats haven't completely destroyed it by then. The difference with classics is that the word classic inherently contains a value judgment about the book described as such. So it's all good to say a classic is a book that contains some truth about humanity, or a book that speaks of universal experiences, or a book that changed the course of literature. These definitions are, by themselves, quite meaningless. Instead, let's look at some books that have been listed as classics over the course of the last century or so, because that will tell us a lot more about what we actually consider a classic than a lofty but ultimately nebulous definition. One easy way of establishing what's considered a classic is by seeing what's printed, sold, and marketed as such. There are, after all, whole publishing imprints, whole publishing houses devoted to that sector of literature. Oxford World's Classics, for example, was founded in 1901. It's got classics in the name and did right from the start. So let's have a look and see what they published in those early years. Here's a list of the 10 books chosen for the very first print run in 1901. The first thing I noticed is that only 5 of those 10 are books you might find on a modern list of must-read classics. The 2 Brontes, the Dickens, and the poetry volumes by Keats and Tennyson. The Vicar of Wakefield is an interesting inclusion here because it's a perfect example of a book that once appealed to many readers, but fell out of popularity in the last century or so. It was written by Oliver Goldsmith and published in 1766, so what we would still consider the early days of the novel. But its popularity lasted well into the Victorian period. It's a story of romance and drama, of deceit and heroism. It's domestic and satirical, but at the same time quite melodramatic. These days, it's very much delegated to the honourable mentions of 18th century literature, nowhere near as well known to the general reader as Robinson Crusoe or Gulliver's Travels or Evelina. Let's get back to the Oxford World's Classics list though, because some of the other entries are just bizarre. Hazlitt's Table Talk? Really? This is a collection of political and philosophical essays from the early 19th century, and certainly a choice. I can guarantee that if I asked 100 literary editors to put together a list of 10 books to make up a series with the title World's Classics, Hazlitt would not be on that list. Which brings me to another point. This list of books is called Oxford World's Classics. World Classics. World Classics. Okay, that's not entirely fair because Ralph Waldo Emerson was, of course, American. But do 9 English authors and 1 American really warrant the word world in World Classics? There are so many lists of classics from different time periods and different publishing houses that we can look at, and from those extrapolate the ways in which the term has been interpreted over the years. I get it, I too love a good list. And some of these lists have really made an impact. Let's take, for example, the series of 54 volumes published by Encyclopaedia Britannica in 1952 with the grand title Great Books of the Western World. Unlike the Oxford World's Classics series, which was published in pocket-sized books priced at 1 shilling, these Great Books of the Western World were not aimed at the general public. They were curated for consumption by students and academics. Om nom nom. We're not doing a deep dive into this particular list because honestly, I don't even know where to start with it. Quite a lot of it is ancient Greek and Roman texts, but there's also, as you'd expect, the complete works of Shakespeare on there. There's a good deal of philosophical writing by Hume and Locke and Kant. There's also the American Declaration of Independence included, and for some reason, a whole volume of Sigmund Freud's writing. It's interesting to note that the vast majority of those great books of the Western world are non-fiction, but there are a few novels included, such as Gulliver's Travels, Tom Jones, Moby Dick, and War and Peace. Every single one of the books on this list was written by a male author. For the second edition of this set, which came out in 1990, so nearly 40 years after the first edition, they added 4 women to the list. Some of you devil's advocates might point out that the Great Books of the Western World series doesn't actually use the words classics. Ha, I did that for you, didn't I? Okay then, you pedants, let's briefly look at some publications who do use the word. The 20th century brought a whole slew of publishing houses and imprints selling series of books marketed specifically as classics, just like the Oxford World's Classics series I mentioned earlier. Anyone who reads classics and buys secondhand books will be familiar with those. They were printed by the bucket load in the 20th century, and to this day they're generally to be had for cheap in charity shops, secondhand bookshops and antiquarian bookshops. These types of cheaply printed classics were a dime a dozen in the 20th century, or 10 a penny, or whatever currency-based common phrase you prefer. Collins Classics, for example, sold 50 million copies in the first half of the 20th century. They had 500 different titles in their selection at that time. At this point, I would like to point you to an absolute goldmine of research about the publication of classics in the 20th century, and that's the website seriesofseries.com. It's a meticulously put together index of those series, and this video would not have been possible without it. Go and have a look at your own bookshelf. I'm sure you'll have at least one 20th century reprint of a classic on there. My book collection is made up almost entirely of books I bought secondhand, so obviously I have loads. Here's just a few. This is my copy of Evelina by Fanny Burney. It's an Everyman's Library edition printed in 1927. Just look at this gorgeous title page. Or this copy of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens from the aforementioned Oxford World's Classics series. If you remember from a few minutes ago, this title was one of the 10 to be chosen for the very first print run in 1901, though this particular edition is from 1985. Here's another Oxford World's Classic, Castle Rackrent by Maria Edgeworth, this one printed in 1980. You know, Castle Rackrent. Who doesn't know Castle Rackrent? It's a classic. Says so right here. This is my copy of E.M. Forster's The Longest Journey, which the cover tells me is a modern classic. This novel was first published in 1907, nearly 120 years ago. Not exactly modern by our standards today, but of course this edition was printed in 1964, when the book was just over 50 years old and the author was still alive. If you search for The Longest Journey on the Penguin website today, you'll find that it's now being printed under their normal, non-modern classics line. In this video, I'm focusing on English language publishing, but of course these types of books are being printed by publishers in other countries as well. The Germans among you will be familiar with this brain-aching shade of yellow, the color of every high school student's nightmares. But before Reclam switched to these iconic yellow covers in the 70s, their books looked like this. And if you go back even further in time, you'll get this. Right, let's finish the show and tell and get back to the point. The point being that these are the books that shape our idea of what makes a classic. The people who decide what we consider a classic and what we don't are the people who run the publishing houses, who curate these lines today and throughout the 20th century. But how do they pick the books that get elevated to classic status? Does Mr. Penguin Random House really care about whether a book is a work of enduring excellence or not? No, Mr. Penguin Random House prints what sells. These classics exist, and exist in huge numbers, because there's a demand for them. Wait, so does that mean that it's not actually Mr. Penguin Random House who decides what makes a classic? Oh no, this better not be a chicken and egg situation. I hate chicken and egg situations. Fine, let's go there. On the one hand, we have the chicken, that's the publishing houses providing us with classics by the million. On the other, there's the egg, that's the demand for classics, in case you're as confused about this as I am. I really feel like I chose the wrong metaphor for this. Anyway, this demand is created by an influential and secretive group of people telling us that these are the books worth reading. I'm talking, of course, by the people who write the lists. And let me tell you, there's a lot of lists. Every newspaper, magazine, website and broadcaster, from the BBC to Southern Living, has made at least one of them, usually with titles like 100 books to read before you die, or 50 must-read classics. Honestly, that sense of urgency is somewhat disconcerting. These lists aren't created in a vacuum. It's not like someone at Fox News sat down, read every single book in existence, and then picked their favorite 18? Seriously, you couldn't think of around 20? Actually, reading some of these descriptions, it sounds a lot like whoever put together this list hasn't read any of them at all. Pride and Prejudice has become one of the most popular classic novels of all time. It was written by Jane Austen and was the author's second published book. Released in 1813, the novel is about the love story of Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy. Wow, you're really selling it there, Ashlyn. Little Women follows the lives of sisters Meg, Jo, Beth and Amy from childhood through adulthood. If that isn't going to get the Fox News audiences storming the bookshops, I don't know what will. Come on now, Ashlyn, I know you can do better than that. Who even are you? Ah, that explains it. Ashlyn's job is not to recommend you her all-time favorite books, but rather to write an article that comes up in search when you type best classics into Google. Needless to say, it works. Every list like that has an agenda, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. This video has an agenda too, in case you haven't noticed. In some cases, that agenda might be pretty obvious, like the purpose of Pan Macmillan's classic books to read before you die list is to make you buy Pan Macmillan books. The purpose of Penguin's 100 must-read classics list is to make you buy Penguin books. In other cases, it's a more subconscious bias, which is something we all have. That's the reason why the Art of Manliness list of 100 books every man should read only features 7 books written by women. Because someone who's made the glorification of masculinity their entire career might not naturally consider that men aren't the only humans capable of the written word. This 100 Greatest Novels of All Time list was published in The Observer in 2003. As you'd expect, the majority of the authors listed are white, British and male. There's only 14 books written by women on there and only 6 books written by authors of colour. What I'm saying is that this list has been put together by a white middle-class Englishman, and you can really tell. The weirdest thing about the Observer list is that the author is actually aware of this discrepancy. Right at the bottom of the article he asks, who did we miss? Have women been shortchanged? What's happened to novels in translation? So in this case, I can't even excuse his bias as being subconscious because he is very clearly conscious of it, but not bothered about it enough to actually, I don't know, rethink the list? Well done, Robert. Truly outstanding. So by this point in the video, we can all agree that the term classics is entirely subjective, right? And that means that it's informed by the opinions and experiences not of the wider readership of books, but of those who run publishing houses and media companies. The people who write lists for a living. That's where the problem lies. Of course, I can make a video with the title 50 Classics You Must Read Before the Inevitable Apocalypse Forces Us to Use Paperbacks as Kindling, but it would hardly make a difference now, would it? It wouldn't change the curriculums of high schools and university courses. It wouldn't make the BBC commission a 6-part adaptation of Florence Dick Pixies' feminist Victorian utopia novel Gloriana or The Revolution of 1900 just because I think it deserves one. When you have the same kind of voices, that of Mr. Penguin Random House and What's-His-Face from The Guardian, dictating what we consider a classic, can you really claim that these are the books that somehow represent all of humanity? The problem is not that the word classic as we use it today is subjective. It's that a lot of readers are under the mistaken impression that it isn't. I've read you a few definitions at this point, so here's a few more. This time I've taken them not from the texts and essays of published writers or from dictionaries and encyclopedias. This time we're going to Reddit, truly the voice of the people. 2 years ago, someone asked on r/literature, what makes a classic a classic? Here are some of the replies. I hold a more fluid definition of classics, books continuously studied by writers and literature academics seeking inspiration. The selection of these books, in turn, are contingent on the fulfillment of some or all criteria for literary merit, such as immense social, cultural, or political influence on the milieu, meaningful philosophical undertones, novel and/or complex aesthetic literary structure. This person puts a lot of trust into the opinion and taste of academics. But academics are just people too. And just like the editors of newspapers and publishing houses, they tend to come from certain sectors of society. Those we commonly describe as privileged. This is not a video about privilege. Well, I suppose it is actually, but it's not a video about the concept of privilege. Even so, you don't need me to tell you that it's much easier for certain people to make it into positions of power in publishing, journalism, and academia than others. Positions that make it possible for them to dictate what the rest of the world considers a classic. Other users on Reddit argue that a classic is more broadly defined by society as a whole. I think a classic is whatever makes an impact on either society or literature, either when it's published or years afterwards. I read that wrong. That was posted as a question. So, either when it's published or years afterwards? What determines what qualifies as a classic is a consensus opinion that something old is still worth reading. A book is a classic if it passes the test of time, meaning that a reasonable number of people are still reading it. But phrases like a book that passes the test of time and a book that makes an impact are deceptive because they sound objective, they sound indisputable, but they very clearly aren't. That being said, there is some consensus among the publishers and academics and newspaper editors about which books are worthy of being called a classic. Of course there's consensus among them, that's the whole point I've been making. If there's no diversity in the group of people choosing what can be called a classic, there won't be much diversity in the books they pick. So let's look at one book that's on nearly every single list I've looked at, and that's Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This novel was published in 1818, and pretty much anyone with a definition of a classic includes this book in that definition. Even The Art of Manliness has it as one of the 7 books written by women on their list of 100 books every man should read. Imagine that. These days, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley is widely acknowledged as a pioneering author of early science fiction. Her legacy is as strong as ever. Frankenstein is a classic, beyond doubt. It ticks all the boxes. It's a book that defined a genre. It's a book that enriched the human mind with its ideas. It's a book that has influenced not just literature, but culture as a whole. Anyone who's read it would agree with me on that. It's groundbreaking and it's unique. But what about the author's other work? In 1826, 8 years after the publication of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley published another novel that defined a genre, another first, another groundbreaking work of fiction. The Last Man is considered to be the first dystopian and post-apocalyptic novel. It's set in the late 21st century and tells the story of a world that's been ravaged by a deadly pandemic. It's brimful of themes, thoughts, and concepts that are still so relevant today, from personal ones like loneliness, love, and ambition, to bigger ideas like climate change, the abolition of the monarchy in Britain, and of course, the end of civilization as brought about by disease. It ticks all the same boxes as Frankenstein, all of them. And yet I haven't seen it on any of the classics to read before you die lists. Not a single one. According to the Wikipedia article about the book, the novel was critically savaged and remained largely obscure at the time of its publication. It was not until the 1960s that the novel resurfaced for the public. I'm not going to go into the critically savaged at time of publication bit, because that's a topic for a whole other video. And yes, at some point there will be a video about this book because it's fascinating. But why did it remain obscure until the 1960s? And is that possibly the reason why this is not as well known as Frankenstein? The answer is simply that The Last Man was out of print all the way until 1965, when it was first reprinted by the University of Nebraska Press. Before then, there were only 3 editions of the book, 2 published in 1826 by the original publisher in London, and 1 pirated one that made its way to America in 1833. Looks like book piracy goes back a long way. So unless you had one of these copies from the early 19th century, you literally couldn't buy The Last Man until 1965. And that's only the English language edition. The first translation into German wasn't published until 1982. That's over 150 years after The Last Man was written. That particular translation from 1982 was heavily criticized for changing and abridging the original text beyond recognition. The first accurate translation into German was only released in 2021. These days, all the big publishing houses are selling their own edition of The Last Man. But if this novel hadn't been written by the author who wrote the classic Frankenstein, it will probably be even more obscure. There are many books from the 19th century and earlier that haven't been reprinted since, that haven't received any attention at all, whether they deserve it or not. The Last Man, the book about the humanity-wiping pandemic, received a new wave of attention in 2020, for obvious reasons. But it's still mostly known to people with a particular interest either in the history of post-apocalyptic and dystopian fiction, or Mary Shelley, or early 19th century fiction in general. Perhaps The Last Man will be accepted into the canon of the great classics by magazine editors in the future. Perhaps it won't. But isn't it ridiculous that we attribute its value as a piece of literature to that? As much as you might like the idea that a classic is a book that has an inherent, objective, indisputable quality of classicness to it, something we can define and measure, that's simply not the case. We, the readers, are told what's a classic by people in a position of influence. If a book doesn't make it onto one of those lists, it doesn't count. And I just can't be arsed with that. I want to talk about The Last Man the same way I talk about Frankenstein. I want to talk about obscure books by obscure authors that haven't had the good fortune of being Mr. Penguin Random House's favourite. I want to talk about books that What's-His-Face from The Guardian doesn't bother with because they weren't written by white middle-class Englishmen. And we don't have a term for that. If I say I like to read old books, people think I mean something like this. And so I stubbornly cling to the term classic, which, as I've discussed, really doesn't do as a concept. When I talk about classic books, I'm using the term much in the same way people talk about classic cars. I'm literally just talking about age. Any other classification, any attempt at separating some of those old books to be put in a category above the rest, perpetuate this idea that there is an inherent classicness, which can only be defined by those privileged enough to be making lists for a living. Since the beginning of this channel, I have deliberately disregarded all popular definitions of the word classic. As far back as 2018, in much more innocent times, I stated my own, and here it is. A classic, according to Claudia, is any book that was written and/or published before 1960. Going by time of creation is the only truly objective way to classify the books I like to read and talk about on this channel. And I'm still sticking to it 6 years later, though I wonder if I should change the cutoff year as we move further into the future. 1965 maybe? Or should I make it more dynamic and define a classic as any book that's older than 60 years? Maybe that makes more sense. I'll have a think about that. And you have a think about what you consider the definition of a classic. Feel free to tell me in the comments. Thank you for watching. Bye!